This is the continuation of part 1 of the animerecap series of Strongest Man Save the Orphan Girl who is looking for her brother. While discussing about El Dorado, Gina suggests that the group visit Fair Sail de Simo to get more information about it. Once at the small settlement built on islands of woven reeds on a lake in the mountains, Sword and Sophie bounce on the reeds with excitement. Kids gather around Gina excited at her return, but is cut short when the elder tells them about a gun-wielding alchemist and that El Dorado has become a problem. Gina buys many motto tools using huge amounts of money while Sword talks with the elder. At night, the group attend a ceremony to travel to the land of guidance and enter the temple that only appears during a full moon. As Gina undergoes the trial, she easily defeats a pack of wolves, but then a minotaur monster appears. Gina has a hard time fighting the monster in the beginning, but eventually wins and earns a stone of protection using many weapons and spells. The guardian of the temple possesses Mia and tells them about King and the location of El Dorado, a place which lies beyond El Salvados to the southwest. After the guardian warns them about the darkness, Sophie dozes off for a minute while having a vision of her brother calling for help. As they set off, Gina gives the gem to Sophie. Luke arrives in a small settlement after being told by the elder of Fair Sail de Simo that it would be a personal shortcut for him. While wandering around, Luke finds a Makai Alchemist symbol on a door and then meets Stella. Stella's grandpa then opens the door and accidentally hits her. He then sees Stella crying and threatens to beat Luke for making her cry, but it is eventually cleared up. Stella tells him the legend of a demon sealer who sealed a demon nearby many years ago. Apparently the seal has weakened and the demon is about to awaken with the impending full moon. While taking Luke to the place where a statue of the demon sealer once stood, a group of older women ask if Stella pulled another traveler again, but Stella's grandpa's wheelchair starts to go down the cliff. Stella almost falls trying to save her grandpa, but fortunately Luke saved them both. After locating the sea cave where the demon was sealed with Luke's help, Luke gets a vision of a night that became a horror when he touched the ruins inside. After returning and eating dinner, Stella's grandpa tells Luke why Stella is fascinated with the occult and asks him not to involve her. At the night of the full moon, Luke goes to the cave to prevent the horror from reappearing, but Stella follows him. The powerful horror awakes and Luke tries to fight him with all the weapons at his disposal, but the horror is stronger and Luke's hair is cut short. While recalling how he was once a great Makai Knight like his father, Luke breaks free of the horror's tendrils and unites the will of the spirits of those the demon defeated in the past and manages to destroy it. As he leaves, Luke wipes Stella and her grandpa's memories of the previous night's events. After the people that were chosen to go to El Dorado pass by a town full of poverty, they enter El Dorado. One of them is Bezel, a horror that has infiltrated El Dorado looking for King. While looking for him, Bezel consumes 2 men and turns them into his clones, but not before being detected by Bishop. After consuming his 3rd victim, Bezel goes to a park and sees the young lady from his bus accepting a free invitation to an exclusive party. Elsewhere, Bishop discusses with Queen about Garo's imminent arrival and King's plans. After going to the party, Carol is chosen along with 2 other ladies, but she finds out that it's entrapped to provide food for horrors. While running, Carol recognizes Bezel as the guy from her bus and asks him for help, but Bezel then consumes her. The horrors become mad because Bezel interrupted their feast, but he kills them all except for the party's host, all of this while he is being observed remotely by Bishop and Queen. Bezel approaches King's golden tower with the host's directions and uses him to break the tower's barrier. Bezel progresses through the tower until he encounters Queen. Bezel states what he would do in King's place, but Queen disagrees and they fight. Bezel splits into multiple clones, but Queen easily disposes of them using her Makai plants and defeats Bezel. He escapes through a hole he made, but is found out by Bishop, who mocks him through many television screens. Bishop then appears on the other side of the street. Bezel transforms and attacks him, but Bishop dodges it and Knight cuts Bezel in 2. Bishop sings happily and goes to check on the creation of horrors with Dr. Stanley. Sword, Gina and Sophie arrive at a town near the ocean, but Sophie is angry at Sword for eating her chocolate without permission. While Sword goes to the market alone, he buys a box of chocolate for himself and 2 more for kids that couldn't afford it. Pedro is then seen running away from a couple of thugs as he had gotten himself into trouble. As the young man is knocked down and the 2 are about to land another blow, Sword catches up and quickly disappears with him before they even notice. Sword wants nothing to do with Pedro, but he goes with him in the end because Pedro mentioned a good woman in a restaurant. At the place, Sword gets disappointed by the good woman Pedro mentioned and witnesses people making fun of Pedro for being a crybaby and for foolishly attempt to get revenge on Gordon. At the hotel, Sophie receives the stone of protection from the land of guidance from Gina. Pedro asks for Sword's help, but Sword refuses as he uses the death of his own sister to show him that if he died, who will remember her. After leaving Pedro's home, Sword stands in the beach and recalls the death of his sister and how it was living with her. Pedro again gets beaten up, and Sword again rescues him, scaring off the gang members. Pedro then seizes this opportunity to pick up a gun and point it to Gordon, but doesn't shoot because the charm Monica gave him breaks, telling him not to do it, and Pedro bursts down in tears. Gordon escapes, but he hits a truck carrying pigs and all the pigs escape and step on his face. As they prepare to leave the town, Sword gives Sophie the box of chocolate he bought earlier and she shares it with the three of them, making her happy. As the group sit at Chiaki's gas station, an eclipse suddenly blocks the sun and a battalion of monster truck horrors appear. Sword attacks them and sends Gina and Sophie to another route using the car. Sword then transforms and destroys many horrors along with his Zaruba-controlled motorcycle, causing Bishop to flee from the horror he was riding. Bishop then follows Gina and Sophie with a wave of sesmes that fold into projectiles and attack the car. Gina accelerates the car quickly enough for the Gatling gun on the rear to be in position, and Sophie uses it to destroy most of the sesmes. Two sesmes almost catch Sophie, but Luke arrives just in time, destroying the remaining horrors and breaking the eclipse barrier. Suddenly a new horror, Salkin, emerges from below the ground and causes the car to flip while hands appear from a portal to capture Sophie. Sword rescues Sophie and then Zaruba carries her away to safety on the motorcycle. Sophie cries for all the trouble she has caused her friends, but Zaruba tells her to keep moving forward. They are eventually caught by Knight, but Zaruba sacrifices himself and rams the motorcycle into Knight, causing an explosion. Gina and Luke catch up with Sophie, and Sword absorbs the remaining power of Zaruba. A newly upgraded Garo battles Balg and causes powerful shockwaves. However, after testing Sword's powers, Knight withdraws from the battle and leaves Sophie and the others to mourn the loss of Zaruba. As Sword, Gina, Sophie, and Luke approach El Dorado, Gina tells them she is going back to the Land of Guidance to restock since the last attack destroyed her weapon inventory. Once at the gate, Luke uses his memory erasing rain on the guards to sneak into El Dorado. Sword, Luke, and Sophie eventually find a base of operations and Luke uses a protection charm on it. As per orders from the Watchdog Center, the group sets out to find the real identity of King. They explore the city at night and Sword tries out the variety of technology developed by the Gar-Eden Corporation. After eating in a diner and separating from Luke, Sophie enters the Eldonet virtual world and finds out that the people there do not mind if one or two of their friends disappear as long as there is happiness. But then she meets a suspicious avatar that mentions the Golden Knight and receives a letter. In the club Hemrio once managed, Luke learns that horrors gathered there regularly. Once Luke is back, Sword holds a map where they suspect horrors gather to eat people. Luke asks if Sword and Sophie found out anything and Sword shows Luke the invitation Sophie received. Suspecting it to be a trap, Sword, Luke, and Sophie go to a mall in construction where they are met by a drone. After following the drone, the group meets a former employee of Gar-Eden Corporation who reveals that El Dorado is run by horrors who use it as a feeding ground and how he found out about it suddenly. His hideout is attacked by assault horrors and they flee while Sword encounters some of them. After realizing that he did nothing more than hide, the man transfers his data to Sophie's cell phone in case something happens to him. After the backup completes, Sophie sees the silhouette of a woman for a short while and then the cameras activates. Sophie then helps Luke track the approaching horrors by revealing their location. Sophie then turns on all the lights and Luke finishes off most of the horrors, but a muscular one catches Luke by surprise and was about to throw him down. Fortunately, Garo arrives and cuts down the Norma and saves Luke from the fall. On one of the files, Sophie discovers that her brother, Martin Hens, is the programmer involved with the true El Dorado. In the end, they help the man escape through the docks and Luke tells him to use his motorcycle that is parked in the slums near the entrance of El Dorado, while Sword tells him to go to Fei Long's restaurant later. Luke asks Sophie how she knew where the horrors were and she says a girl told her. The group is left with even more unanswered questions. Bishop and Queen discuss and agree on capturing Sophie as per King's orders. Sophie researches the Gar-Eden Corporation and finds that it was once a small company that merged with Cygnus Ram Tech 10 years ago, a company that Sword seems to remember. After eating out in a restaurant, Sword meets Sophie in their hideout and she thanks him for all the things he has done for her. Luke then appears with a problem. Makai plants have infested the Tower of El Dorado and started eating the human workers. The group saves a survivor and encounter Queen while looking for more survivors. Queen uses the carnivorous plants to attack them while the survivor reveals himself as the Dr. Stanley and abducts Sophie. The doctor brings her to the place where the true El Dorado is and tells her his past, but she uses this chance to escape. While looking for an exit, Sophie finds a door with the name of her brother and enters. Inside the office, Sophie cries after reading her brother's diary because he thought about her after all this time, but then she finds the fake letters that Sophie sent him. Sophie is caught again by Stanley and Queen. While walking towards the true El Dorado, Sophie sees a lot of dead people that were once citizens of El Dorado inside huge tubes. Suddenly, Sword and Luke find her using a tracker in her neck. Luke stays back to hold off Queen while Sword goes after Stanley. Sword manages to knock down the doctor and save Sophie, but Bishop arrives and throws them a baby-sized Stanley with an explosive charge in his mouth. After Sword faints protecting Sophie from the blast, Bishop drags and sends her to the true El Dorado, with Sword following after her. Sophie wakes up back at home where she finds her brother outside, and Sword wakes up to find a young lady. Inside the true El Dorado, Martin reveals to Sophie that it is a world he created as an utopia. Elsewhere, Sword questions the authenticity of the Lizzie in front of him, but she acknowledges she cannot prove she is the real Lizzie and tells him she's only there to supply him with information. Meanwhile, on the outside, Luke carries Sword's unconscious body to a hallway where he encounters Gina. Martin presents Queen as his secretary to Sophie, not knowing that she is a horror and that she has already met Sophie before. Since a person retains their senses inside El Dorado, Martin creates a vending machine that creates an ice cream for Sophie. While the people inside of El Dorado congratulates Martin for bringing Sophie and for the near completion of the true El Dorado, Sophie discovers that her brother is the king of El Dorado that has caused her so much pain. Back at Lizzie's place, Lizzie tells Sword that the people there are actually the souls of people who have died and have been captured. She explains that an ancient horror infiltrated Cygnus Ram Tech after learning of their brain research and completed the theory of EldoNet. However, his plan was discovered by the Makai Knights. After a fierce battle with them, the horror self-destructed the facility, and unbeknownst to everyone, he survived along with the prototype of EldoNet. Suddenly, the people outside turn into mechanical spiders and attack them. Lizzie then asks Sword to save Sophie and destroy El Dorado. Meanwhile, Sophie reveals Martin that it has already been 3 years since he disappeared and not half a year like he thought, and that the outside city of El Dorado is run by horrors. Unaware that thousands died as a result of El Dorado, Martin dismisses Sophie's warnings as brainwashing from a rival corporation. After successfully escaping from the horde of horrors, Lizzie asks Sword to destroy the horror and free all the souls inside the true El Dorado. While Martin tells Sophie how much people have joined the true El Dorado since the alpha testing, Lizzie successfully appears and grabs hold of Sophie while Sword is descending towards them. Queen appears and attacks Sword until she restrains him, but Lizzie comes and sends Sword back to the real world. After Sophie sees Martin's demonic shadow, she attempts to kill him by throwing both of them off the platform. Awakening in the real world, Sophie tries to strangle Martin, but he resists and they both fall from the stairs. Martin eventually sees the dead bodies of the sacrificed people while a tearful Sophie strangles her brother. In a flashback, Martin and Sophie are orphaned and wait inside while 4 men in black discuss about what to do with them. The flashback then changes to Martin promising to protect Sophie and create a world where everyone can live happily without difficulties. Back in the present, Sophie shows Martin the people who died because of him and tearfully strangles him. Elsewhere, Queen wakes up from the true El Dorado and questions Bishop if he really killed Sword like he was ordered to or not. Sophie mistakenly believes Martin is a horror because of all the lives he sacrificed for her sake and tries to kill him before Sword comes and does it, but Martin escapes from Sophie scared and confused. Meanwhile, Sword, Luke and Gina drive towards El Dorado, but Queen attacks them using her Makai plants before a strange frequency turns the citizens into horrors. In order to save Sophie, Sword manages to run past Queen and leaves the others to fight Queen. Martin tries to contact Queen, Bishop, and Knight for assistance to no avail. Martin then recalls when he was first approached by Queen and after that when he started working for the Garo Corporation. Outside, Gina evacuates the remaining people of El Dorado while Luke unsuccessfully tries to take Queen down. Inside the tower, Martin proceeds to the exit, but he is too emotionally distraught and King takes advantage of this and dives him further into darkness. Queen is unaffected by Luke's attack, but thanks to a sniper shot from Gina, the bullets collide and create a magical barrage that greatly injures Queen. Luke aims and tries to finish her off, but Queen manages to escape. A mentally unstable Martin finds Sophie and drives her out before the Madu ring consumes him and turns him into a horror that reveals Martin's miserable face on its chest. While watching the situation through the cameras, Bishop points out that King sure took his time. Back at the entrance, King reveals Sophie that it's her fault that her brother turned into a horror as Sword arrives. Martin tries to crawl out from King's abdomen, but he is pulled back by King as Sophie watches in horror. Martin's hand tries to escape again, but this time King eats his hand and then attacks Sword and Sophie. Sword and Sophie manage to escape while King turns the city's lights red and remotely collapses the buildings. As Luke and Gina part their ways after agreeing on evacuating the remaining people, Gina hears a motorcycle and remarks that he's here. After running away for a while, Sword and Sophie are finally surrounded by red gargoyle horrors, but the motorcycle arrives and reveals a newly rebuilt Zaruba. Sword and Sophie manage to escape from El Dorado along with the remaining people and Luke and Gina behind them. Gina hugs a depressed Sophie and Sword reveals to Gina and Luke that King used her to get to Martin, with Luke pointing out that there's no reason to involve Sophie anymore. King commences his plan and people around the world lose consciousness. Nearby TVs turn on and Lizzie alerts Sword and the group that King is already forcing souls into ELDOnet and that Sophie is the only person that can stop him. After Zaruba talks to Sophie and convinces her to help them, Sword and Sophie get on Zaruba while Gina kisses Sword. They are then attacked by Knight, but Luke and Gina tell them to go on while they stay to fight Knight and the newly arrived Queen. Sword and Sophie burst back into the chamber where the true El Dorado and forcibly enter inside it. Inside, they see corpses floating in the sky and Lizzie tells them it is because of King, but then they are surrounded by the guard bots. Back in the outside world, Luke and Gina fight their respective opponent. Sword and Zaruba stay to fight while Lizzie and Sophie go to the terminal in order to shut ELDOnet down. Luke and Knight fight, with the latter remarking that Luke's inability to cut his past is his limit. Sophie manages to activate the terminal, but 3 gigantic eel horrors appear and attack Sword. As more of them appear, Sword transforms along with Zaruba, but while trying to dodge them, they are sucked inside of King, a colorless void where the souls King took are. Back with Lizzie and Sophie, the terminal starts creating electricity and hurts Sophie while Bishop attempts to stop them with the guard bots, but Lizzie activates a defensive barrier. Luke fights the best he can, but he is eventually stabbed by Knight in his shoulder. Gina and Queen also fight, but Queen suddenly reveals her horror form. Back with Sword unconscious body, King comments how they never change, that no matter which era they are on or how many times he crushes them, they always pop up like pestilent insects and fight back. Sophie attempts to shut down the terminal again, but Lizzie tells her that if she keeps interacting with it, she will disappear. Sword gets up and a surprised King asks how, something to which Sword replies because that's what it means to live, while showing how all the people he met throughout his journey recovered from their suffering. Luke and Gina fight with everything they have in a first battle and eventually defeat their opponents. Sword and Zaruba fight against King and his horde of digital puppets and are successful in escaping. By combining his Garokin with Zaruba, he uses the sword and cuts down King. Sophie struggles to destroy the ELDOnet storage unit, but when one of her tears falls on her stone of protection, she sees Martin and a younger version of herself and eventually receives the password, "Everything is for my sister." ELDOnet begins to disappear and Lizzie says her goodbye to Sophie while Knight spares Luke. But as Sword exits King's void, he is intercepted by Knight wearing his Makai armor. They two of them fight fiercely and their ideals clash. Finally, Sword defeats Knight, who pulls the Garokin deeper into his body, ending his life and destroying the corrupted bulb. Outside, Sophie asks why Sword hasn't come back yet, but Gina and Luke remain quiet. Sophie tries to go back in, but she is stopped by Gina and starts crying. Luke then approaches them and uses one of his magical bullets and erases Sophie's memories. A year has passed since the defeat of King. Sophie was returned to the orphanage and resumed her teenage life. She is about 15 years old and life hasn't been entirely the same. Although her memories has been erased, her heart and mind has always felt as if she was missing something very important. Throughout this time, she would space out and experience feelings of missing someone or something important. Sword. One day, during Christmas, Sophie cut her finger and the sight of blood triggered her memories. As soon as Sophie remembered, she ran into her closet to search for her own hoodie she had worn during her travels with Sword. She was happy to find it and rediscover the pendant Gina gifted her earlier. Now fully awakened, she ran off to find Sword. Sophie ran through the snow, desperate to see Sword. She made it back to the diner to find Gina there. Gina, glad to know Sophie remembers their history, and Sophie expressed great desire to become an alchemist herself. Garm and Gina welcomed Sophie into the fold and expressed great excitement to see Sword again. Although surprised to see Sophie, his stomach was still hurt him and he went back to poop. This is the end of the video, so please watching all of my anime recap series. Thanks for watching.